Hi everyone, I hope that you're doing great. I'm on fire as usual, and I'm very happy to present my talk for the Mobile DevOps Summit 2022 entitled A Guided Tour to Cross-Platform Mobile Development. I'm the speaker, Yassin Ben Abbas. I work as a developer relations at Worldline. I'm a teacher and trainer also. You can find me in different social networks with the handle which is shown here. And by the way, some images were generated by this AI across the presentation. So let's get started. So first of all, I'll give an introduction and then show some cross-platform categories and some frameworks behind these categories. In the end, I will give some advices on which framework to use depending on your needs, and we'll finish with a conclusion. Okay, let's give some context. I would like to develop an app that targets as many users as possible. And you know that mobiles are everywhere. 5.48 billion unique mobile users as of October 2022. That's a big number. So Android and iOS share a big user base. In addition to that, it will be nice to also support desktops and browsers because they are still largely used. So, is there a way to develop an app, a mobile-first app, with a single code base and target as many platforms as possible? Hopefully, nowadays we have many and even too many choices. As you can see here, this is a selection of the most famous frameworks. There are others that I haven't shown here for the because of time mostly, but there are many frameworks. And there are so much many frameworks that it can drive us crazy for the first time when we see all of these. So let's sort this out and start with the basics. So when you develop a mobile app, you have the default choice, which is the official SDKs. Xcode for iOS and Android Studio for Android. But what we're here for is for the cross-platform solutions. So to share as many code as possible and to target as many platforms as possible. For this purpose, we have three categories. So we start from the web app, uh, so web development. And then the second category is hybrid web, so a web app with more features. We'll see this later. And the last category is hybrid native, which is much more closer to the native and official SDKs or native code or native components. We'll see each of these cross-platform framework next, starting with web apps and progressive web apps. So a web app is a website which runs on a browser. It's an application which runs on the browser. And nowadays, browser supports many features and it can satisfy many use cases. So here I highlighted geolocation and notification, but there are many more available. Progressive web apps features add any even more interesting features to browsers, such as offline mode, the ability to install it and put it to the add it to the home screen, as you see with the Starbucks logo in this video that I play right now, after in some seconds. And when you run the application after being installed, it has no browser headers. And of course, when you speak web development, you know that there are many powerful frameworks to get started to create great applications. And also, one of the biggest advantages of web apps and progressive web apps is that you avoid any app store restriction or limitation. For example, Amazon Luna and Xcloud, sorry, have chosen to use progressive web app to be available for iOS users. So let's run this Starbucks progressive web app. As you see that, so it has been installed previously, and now you see when we launch it, we have a splash screen, which is another feature available as for progressive web apps. And you see that we have headerless browsing, no address bar. It's really behave like a native app with even the green status bar. And thanks to web technologies, you see that this web view or this web page is really similar to a native app, and it even makes coffee or allows us to order coffee. So that's great. There is a website even that can help you see which browser features are available for your browser relative to your OS, of course. So here we have two smartphones. One is an iOS 14 smartphone, was running Safari, and the other one is a Chrome browser running on Android. Can you guess which one is iOS, which one is Android? So here you see the different features available in the browser that I run the website where I open the website in, and of course the right screen is the Android screen because you know that Android Chrome supports a lot of features, and Safari has less features. So that's one of the drawbacks that you are gonna see right now. So speaking of which, so web apps have many advantages. They work on any platform as long as you have a web browser, really easily accessible through a simple URL. No need to install, I mean, to access it initially, no need to go to a store. It can also later be installed and added to the app list with a nice splash screen, headerless browsing. Can also even go further, publish a progressive web app in the Android App Store and Windows Store. You can do this. You just need to configure your app, but it's feasible. And also it allows to bypass any limitations that you encounter if you want to publish it to any available app store. But for the drawbacks is that if you're looking for visibility in app stores, it's not possible on Apple App Store for a progressive web app unless, as you will see later, you embed it in a hybrid web app. Browsers do not implement the same level of APIs as you have seen with what the web can do today example. So be careful, especially for iOS. It looks like it's always behind in terms of features. And also you have this feeling that it's somewhat different than native apps. Of course, the web experience is great. Responsive apps are getting better and better, but you still have this feeling of it being somewhat different than native apps. Okay, now that you have the web app and you want to go a step further, make it available into a store, this is what we call a hybrid web. So basically, a hybrid web app is a web application or progressive web app which runs within a native application through a web view. So the web page, instead of being run within Chrome, it is run within a native app that contains mostly only a web view. This allows the developer to have access to native SDK APIs through a JavaScript bridge. So native geolocation and any native implementation can be used. So it's a web app with access to native APIs. There are two major actors, Cordova and PhoneGap, which is helps simplifies using Cordova, and Capacitor, which is the most recent framework. So they're both Cordova and Capacitor are what we call web runtimes, uh, web view runtimes, sorry. But I'll talk about capacitor, but it's mostly the same thing. But it looks like capacitor is more modern than Cordova, so maybe this is one is better recommended for to get started. If you want to get started in hybrid web apps, capacitor is better recommended. So it's developed by the Ionic team. Many plugins available. It's even compatible with Cordova plugins. So very big support if you want to, you know that if you want to develop a feature, use a feature, you are sure or there are high chances that you can find an implementation of it. Uh, uh, it can also turn any web app into a hybrid mobile app very easily. So if you want to go a step further and publish to a store, this can be done easily with capacitor tooling. It's agnostic to the UI framework. You can use any UI framework that you want, but it's recommended to use the Ionic UI toolkit, as you can see in the video on the left, on the right side, sorry, which is directly taken from the documentation website. So it's from the browser. You can see a preview of the what the framework will look like on your mobile. That's also a big advantage of using web apps and hybrid uh, web apps is that you can have a faster development cycle because you can run it on the browser. As you can see in the advantages, so you can build and debug on the browser. You have support for live reload. Also, Lots of plugins available through the community of Cordova and Capacitor, and also because they have a big legacy when you combine both of them. And also you can mix Capacitor with native screens. So you can have screens which are native and screens which show a web view that is managed by a capacitor. So you can also have both of these two worlds. Of course, the drawback is that you have the web view drawbacks, the performance, the UX, which feels somewhat different than native apps, and the capacitor app size, which is, as far as I read, which is bigger than Cordova. But maybe it can be optimized with future versions. So it's something that we need to be careful about. Okay, so now we have seen um, web apps as a cross-platform category. We can take it a step further and embed it in a native application with a native hybrid web app, which allows us to have access to native APIs and also have an application which can be published to the stores. But now we want to go a step even further where we can talk directly with native components or native code. So that's the hybrid native approach. What do I mean by hybrid native approach? Is that it's any framework that generates native UI or native code for multiple targets, which means that as long as the framework uh, has communicate or shows native UI or compiles to native code, one of these two or both, it's in the hybrid native category. So let's see uh, for how what we have in this category, which is we'll see much more in this category than the other ones. We have much more choices here. So React Native, which is one of the oldest, but also most one of the most famous ones. So it's based on the React framework with regard to the philosophy and the way to architect the application. But it has it has very interesting concept uh, when run with React Native or for mobile development. So there is a JavaScript engine that runs the business code. So it means that you have some kind of hidden web view in your application, and this hidden web view runs your application through the JavaScript engine. However, as soon as there is a call to a native API, geolocation or any other native API, or native UI, so the React calls uses what we call a JavaScript bridge to redirect the call to the native counterpart. So the UI and native APIs are go through the bridge, and we have native components and native APIs. So that's what makes React Native really special, and it's one of the most major hybrid native frameworks. It can also target Windows 10 and the web. So this is an example of Discord application, which is made with React Native. And as you can see, it runs really smoothly, really fast, because and the UI really feels native because it's native UI which is rendered. So the web view is not visible, it's just to execute the JavaScript logic. That's why React has this reputation of having two sides, you know, the JavaScript side, which runs the logic, and the native side, which runs the UI and the native APIs. And of course, the ugly side of both is the JavaScript side. So React Native is used by many companies, and of course, this is a mark. This allows to have a certain confidence when we want to use React Native. So to summarize, React Native in terms of advantages, it has a big community. It has advantages of having an architecture, the clean architecture of React apps, especially when you use frameworks like Redux for state management. It's gaining more and more maturity over time, and it supports hot reload. So as drawback, so this is just a warning, not really critical, but it's still version 0 point something. We still not have the version 1 of the framework. So it's just a warning. It's used in production. It works really well. So just a warning. But with regard to the performance, with regard to other native to hybrid native frameworks, the bridge is on paper the slowest method. Even though you see that Discord is really fast, 60 FPS, if I remember correctly, it runs at 60 FPS. So of course, for the majority of cases, the performance is enough. But if you're looking for the biggest performance or better performance, so the bridge on paper is the slowest method. And in terms of bad experience, if you want to read about companies that abandoned, developers that abandoned React Native, you can read the testimony of Airbnb and Udacity because they had JavaScript runtime inconsistencies and crashes which were hard to fix. So, of course, maybe this depends on the use case, on maybe the architecture of the application. There are many factors, but it's interesting to be careful about these use cases or these events. Okay, next, Flutter. So Flutter is the newest framework or the new framework in the scene. So there is MyWe, but it's a special case also. But Flutter is really for me the latest actor in the scene. It's developed by the Chrome team. It targets every platform, iOS, Android, web, and desktop. It compiles to native code, so there is no bridge as in React, but the UI is drawn on a canvas. So the UI is not drawn on a web view, and there is no native component. No web view, no native component. It's an original way here in Flutter. So so Flutter creates a native canvas, a native draw area, and it calls native APIs through the Skia framework to draw its UI. So also a very particular way to do things, but it allows Flutter to be really beautiful, really smooth, really fast. Uh, it's like a game engine. When you have a game engine that draws the screen at 60 FPS, you can see it as something like this, and you see any beautiful animations, really fast. Uh, so that's Flutter. So the language is Dart, and you can use Android Studio or Visual Studio Code for development. So to summarize, Flutter, it has very efficient hot reload, one of the best hot reload in the cross-platform frameworks. Sorry, it has very fast UI and animations, thanks to its way of managing the UI within the framework, not delegating it to the native components. It has fast adoption and very big community, one of the biggest, fastest growing communities. And also, it's a great choice if you want to have the same UX across platforms. Why? Because since the UI is drawn directly by the frameworks, it does not rely on native components. I mean, you get it for free if you have if you draw the UI as for example, material, you will get material UI on both iOS and Android. If you draw the UI using Cupertino library, you will get Cupertino in iOS and Android. So if you want to have the same UI across the platforms, it's a great choice because you get it for free. However, be careful because this means that the native UI is emulated. It's not the real hard native or the real native UI, the correct native UI. It's still complex to have native design. I mean, if you want to have a separate design, so Cupertino design for iOS and the material design for Android, this is still complex to have in Flutter. There are frameworks that can draw differently depending on the platform, but it's still emulated. It's still not perfect, but that's how Flutter works. This is on the nature of Flutter, and be careful of the rent of the overhead. But this is something that we'll see for any UI, any cross-platform framework. So next is MyWe Xamarin. So this is also one of the oldest frameworks. So Xamarin is MyWe is the evolution of Xamarin. So Xamarin, you won't be hearing about it anymore. You will hear MyWe instead of it in its place. So it targets iOS, Android, Windows, and macOS. No Linux and no web. That's too bad. So it's a cross-platform UI toolkit. So you have native UIs and native code. So this has native code of it's similar to Flutter for the native code, and similar to React Native for native UIs, but there is no bridge. Everything is native. It's a C# code using XAML for the UI, and everything is translated into native code behind the scene. Of course, there is the runtime overhead, but everything is native. And you see this app is developed using MyUI, and you see that's very beautiful, very clean app. So you can make great stuff with this framework. So to summarize, one of the biggest advantages for me for MyUI is that you harness or you take advantage of the power of C# and the .NET ecosystem. You have also advantages of Visual Studio tooling, and you can debug on iOS without a Mac. That's really great. Of course, you need the Mac for production. You get also advantage of hot reload, and as drawbacks, it seems not mature compared to other frameworks, still maybe lacking in terms of maturity. The .NET runtime, which adds an overhead, of course, and there is no Linux nor web support, as I said earlier. But for the web, there is the Blazor framework, which is the web framework for .NET. And the last framework that we're going to see is KMM, which has a really original idea, is that it doesn't handle the UI. It's a cross-platform framework only for business logic. And currently, this is a great solution for developers that really like to use the native SDKs for the UI, because that's where it's best for certain developers. This is the best way to make the UI is with native SDKs, and use just the business logic is made with a Kotlin multi-platform. There is even a Kotlin cross-platform UI which is in development, which is called Compose multi-platform, but this is where maybe we'll this is to follow or to watch. But currently, it's Kotlin multi-platform for business logic and Compose, Jetpack Compose for Android UI and Swift UI for iOS UI. Pros and cons. So it's the best development environment for native Android developers with the advantage of having sharing code with iOS developers. It takes the best advantage of native UI, of course, because it delegates it to it doesn't handle it, it delegates it to the developer to use native SDKs. It encourages a clean architecture because we'll separate between the UI part and the business logic. And it also has a fast adoption and growing community, even though it was in alpha. So it's I put it in the drawbacks because it's still in beta. It has entered beta very recently. So, but there are production apps. It works great, but it's still not stable from the creator's perspective. And the architecture of the app must be thought from the ground up because it teaches new things, new ways to develop because you need to separate between the business logic and the UI logic. Okay, now let's summarize and give some big outlines on how to choose which frameworks to choose depending on the situation. So for me, if you have iOS and Android developers on your team, for me the best solution currently is to use Kotlin multi-platform for the business logic and use Xcode and Android Studio for the UI logic. If you don't have as much developers, a lot of developers, and you want to share as much as possible, and you care about native components, you can use React Native or .NET MyUI, and you can use one or the other depending on your ease with the technology. And if you don't care about native components, the popular and default choice is Flutter. If you have web development already done and you want to make it as an app, use Capacitor or Ionic. And finally, if you want to bypass the stores, use a progressive web apps. That's the safest choice if you want to bypass the stores. And there are some numbers that show that Flutter and React Native are still, as I said, Flutter and React Native are still the most popular choices. So maybe also by default, start with Flutter or React Native. Okay, so to conclude, the gap is narrowing between mobile, web, and desktop development, as you have seen. Targeting iOS still requires a Mac, so be careful about this. But as you have seen, mobile development is very fun thanks to the different technologies. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thanks for watching. Here are some links, and thank you very much. Goodbye.